Good day, everyone, and a warm welcome to everyone from across the globe. We hope that everyone is safe and healthy and continue to be so. This is Brenda Stoddard with FDA's Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, Small Business and Industry Assistance Program, also known as CDER, SBIA. Thank you for joining us today for a presentation on conducting clinical trials during the COVID-19 public health emergency. This webinar will discuss the relevant guidance on conducting clinical trials of medical products during the COVID-19 public health emergency, which provides general considerations to assist sponsors in assuring the safety of trial participants, maintaining compliance with good clinical practice, GCPs, and minimizing risk to trial integrity. As a reminder, the webinar, both video and audio, will be posted on our website within 5 business days. And that website is www.fda.gov/CDER/SBIA webinars. The webinar in its entirety will run approximately 45 minutes, which will include a Q&A session. Today, for our presentation, we have the pleasure of having Dr. Jacqueline Corrigan-Curé, who is the Director of CDER's Office of Medical Policy. And right after the presentation, we have the additional pleasure of having Dr. John Concato, Deputy Director, Office of Medical Policy Initiatives within the Office of Medical Policy, who will address our Q&A questions that come in through the question part for the Q&A session. Please let me welcome Dr. Corrigan-Curé.
Thank you very much, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. I know there's a great interest in this topic, and it really speaks to the unfortunate impact that COVID-19 is having across all our sectors, our health, our economy, and the clinical trial enterprise. And so what we're going to talk to you today is the guidance that FDA has put out to help you navigate your clinical trials in this unprecedented situation. I'm trying to advance the slides. Give me a second, my slides are not yet advancing.
Hit the right button first, the arrow.
If someone could advance the slides for me, Ed, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, great. So the focus of this session is going to be on the guidance, but first I'd like to provide a bit of an overview of what FDA is, some of the activities we're engaged in. Then we'll go into explaining the purpose of the guidance and also talk to you about how we invite feedback to inform possible updates. So this is the COVID-19 FDA landing page and a very simple URL. And it really is where you can find the latest information on COVID-19 from FDA. We have frequently asked questions, medical countermeasures, and others. And at the end of my presentation, we have a number of links to help you navigate through that. So our activities include, of course, the review of numerous pre-market, what we call IND submissions for new drugs and biologics to treat this COVID-19, as well as allowing expanded access for investigational drugs. That's for patients who are unable to enroll in a clinical trial, but we feel the risk-benefit to providing access is warranted. And then, of course, all the guidance that's available for industry, investigators and institutional review boards, which we'll talk about one of them today. We are continuing, such as through venues such as this, outreach and listening and soliciting feedback. We also have, you may have heard of emergency use authorizations issued for a number of devices such as ventilators, respiratory devices, or in vitro diagnostics, as well as drugs. And these are not approvals, but they are what we call emergency use, where there's some benefit that we think from providing access while we gather additional data. So just to highlight for anyone who is thinking about developing something for COVID-19, before I get to the clinical trial guidance, I want to emphasize that the CTAP program, this is the Coronavirus Treatment Accelerator program, is where we really are immediately on receipt triaging requests, making sure they get to the right FDA staff, and working to get studies up fast. And this is providing ultra-rapid protocol review, often within 24 hours of submission. That does not mean the trial is up and running in 24 hours, but the protocol itself. And then, of course, this review of individual expanded access requests that are really round the clock, and often they're reviewed within hours. So to just give you a snapshot, as of April, there are now 72 active trials, and these are trials that are under FDA regulation. There may be other trials you might find on clinicaltrial.gov, and then another 211 development programs for therapeutic agents that are in the planning stages. And of course, what we're going to talk to today is our guidance, and all of these guidances, which you can find at this URL at the bottom of the slide, are in effect as soon as they're issued. And we'll talk about the conduct of clinical trials, but as you can see, there's just a range of topics that we're providing guidance from REMS to patient monitoring devices to personal protective equipment, alcohol-based hand sanitizers, temporary compounding of drugs, nutrition labeling, blood and blood components, and animal drugs as well. So moving on now to our topic. So we issued the conduct of clinical trials of medical products during COVID-19 public health emergency guidance first on March 18th, when we began to see the impact that this was going to have on clinical trials. And we've done several updates, most recently on April 16th, 2020. And I'd like to highlight, although it's a little small for you to read on this slide, that this is an FDA guidance. It is the Center of Drugs, the Center of Biologics, the Center of Devices, the Oncology Center for Excellence, and the Office of Good Clinical Practice, as we have a number of questions that address things like consent. So the FDA guidance, the way it's set up, is after an introduction and background, we have details provided into a discussion section, more of our high-level principles sections, I would say, followed by additional resources, and then a Q&A that really tries to go into more detail about some of the principles that we first put out with the first edition. And indeed, the question and answer appendix is really updated based on issues and inquiries we get through our COVID-19 mailbox, where we find that we're getting the same query or there's something generalizable that we think our stakeholders should all know about. And so, for example, the most recently, it was about informed consent from patients unable to travel, remote performance outcome assessments, remote site monitoring, and shipping of investigational products, just providing more granularity to our guidance. The core principle, of course, as everyone I think would agree, is that we want to ensure the safety of trial participants, and that is paramount. It's the first consideration. And then, of course, secondly, we want to focus on protecting trial integrity in the data that we're generating, because certainly that's one of the reasons that patients enroll in clinical trials. They are working with the investigators and sponsors to generate that data so we understand whether something is safe and effective. So we focus on first the patients, then the trial integrity and maintenance with good clinical practice. We provide guidance on issues expected to be encountered and/or mentioned in the COVID-19 mailbox, and the specific questions that may come up on your trial that are very dependent upon assessing the study population or the type of product or endpoint. Those are ones that we might want to contact the FDA Review Division, and we'll talk a little bit about how best to do that. You know, one of the first sort of questions is, should I continue the trial? Should I suspend enrollment? Should I, think about even initiating another trial? And so we outline what we think are some of the key considerations. Certainly there may be others, but we speak to sponsors in consultation with their clinical investigators, their institutional review boards, institutional ethics committees, and if applicable and if available, their data monitoring committees, which typically do risk-benefit assessments, can then assess whether protection of the patient's safety, welfare, and rights is best preserved by continuing a study participant in the trial as per the protocol or the protocol that as it might be amended, or better by discontinuing the administration or use of the product or even participation in the trial. And the considerations are many. One, whether the COVID-19 related limitations on what we can do with the protocol pose new safety risks to the participants, and whether those risks can be mitigated by amending study processes and procedures, and we'll talk a little bit about that. The availability of investigators and sub-investigators to oversee the trial and adequately monitor safety risks depending upon other things that are going on. The availability and ability of sufficient clinical trial staff to be available for the trial, as well as supplies and technological tools. The continued operations and ability to communicate with IRBs and institutional ethics committees and data monitoring committees. Again, at the beginning when we wrote this, there was certainly, I think different procedures have now been in place to help with those communications. Of course, there are a number of public health measures that are going in effect to try and control the spread of COVID-19, and is conduct of the trial feasible in light of those measures. And as we say, important to consider the DMC's assessment of any modifications into the clinical trial and how that fits into the risk-benefit. So if the trial is going to continue, again, safety is paramount, so modifications of the trial should assure that participant safety. We recognize that there's just a lot of potential for alternative procedures for safety assessments. There's technologies to facilitate remote data collection and monitoring. For example, video conferences or perhaps even local laboratories to limit the amount of travel. Protocol modifications, importantly, to eliminate an immediate hazard to participants, may be implemented before IRB and FDA approval. FDA, it's really not approval, but it allows the amendment to go forward, with reporting required afterwards. We also know that it may not be feasible for patients in trials, participants, to travel to trial sites. And so are there alternative delivery methods that could be explored, especially for those kind of products that are normally perhaps picked up at the trial site but self-administered? We also have to think about that if that's not a possibility, even if the investigational product is discontinued, there still may be some additional monitoring that may need to be done. Finally, we realize that COVID-19 screening procedures are happening at healthcare systems and they're mandatory, but that does not need to be reported as a protocol amendment, even if those screening procedures are being done at a visit, unless the data is going to become part of the research objectives. Now, efficacy endpoints, as we said, we talk a lot about trying to look at alternative methods of capturing safety endpoints. For efficacy endpoints, these are the endpoints that are going to really determine whether the trial has shown its primary objective. If they're going to be collected in a different way than agreed upon, we do think that it's important to consult with the FDA review division, especially, if this is going to be a protocol amendment. But again, safety of participants may necessitate missing or altering the assessments even before that consultation. So putting that safety first and then consulting as you're thinking through how you're going to conduct the trial. It is, even with some changes in the protocol, we understand that an efficacy endpoint might not be collected due to COVID-19. And the reason for failing to collect the endpoint should be documented because that will help in the analysis down the road. We did, however, just recently add a question that talked about how you could potentially collect certain performance outcome assessments and interview-based clinician-reported outcomes remotely. Again, a number of considerations is if the remote technology is appropriate for the type of clinical data captured. So, for example, if it's a performance outcome assessment, can you really see the participant performing what you want to assess through the remote technology? You need to consider the need to compare in-person and remote assessments if only some outcome assessments will be captured remotely. So if they're very different when they're captured remotely and compared to in person, that will be problematic as you're trying to make a comparison at the end of the study. So making those remote assessments as close to the in-person is key. Adequately preparing investigators who don't have experience in this will be something to think through. And for some patients who may not have, participants who may not have the technology available, there may be needs to help provide that technology and technology support and how that would be done. Now, data-related issues, and in particular statistical analysis plan like efficacy supplements, it's very important that changes of those be considered carefully and in consultation with review divisions when possible. So first of all, documenting the context when missing data or censoring occurs, consulting the FDA review divisions prior to making changes to data management plans and SAPs. And if there are pre-specified analysis and there's going to be decisions made about how COVID-19 deviations will be handled in the analysis, these decisions should be documented prior to locking the database. Now, as I talked about, investigational product continuation is a very complex issue. The decision of whether to continue the investigational is different than continuing a treatment for a patient because the risks and benefits of investigational products are still being assessed. Nonetheless, the decision to discontinue an investigational product is quite complex and considers a number of issues, including the seriousness of the disease and condition, whether there's reasonable alternatives and risks in taking the patient off of the investigational product compared to the risks of keeping them on, and whether there's any apparent clinical benefit. We talk about that home delivery may be appropriate for certain products to overcome, to address this issue. You do need to assure that during delivery, that drug is kept under appropriate storage conditions, and there are systems put in place to maintain product accountability. If home delivery is only for a limited number of trial participants, this might be accomplished by a series of protocol deviations. However, if the decision is really made to change the entire protocol to have home delivery, then this should probably be described in an IND amendment to the IND or the IDE. Now, some products require infusion, and that becomes more complex. So due to the complexity and potential safety considerations with products delivered by infusion, consultation with the FDA review division on these alternative plans is generally recommended. You need to think about, are there appropriately trained personnel in an alternative site? The storage and handling of such products as they are shipped, that may be more complex with infusion-related products. And that accountability requirements still must be addressed and documented. Now, there may be opportunities for certain participants who are unable to get to the trial site, but are able perhaps to have the investigational product administered locally for them to continue on this. This might happen more, maybe if it's an approved product being tested for a new indication. Again, the same considerations to think about is the local provider experienced with the drug or drug class. Again, it may be easier if this is a drug in a class of an approved drug or even approved drug being looked at for a different indication. Where is this local infusion going to take place? What is their experience? Can you ship the IP, the investigational product, to that local healthcare provider? How will that be done? Again, if commercially available, is it possible to procure locally? And we talked about that reimbursement for locally procured product would be acceptable under our regulatory framework. If a local provider becomes involved in administering the investigational product, some of the questions that come up is whether they are now a sub-investigator and therefore should be added to the 1572. So if the local provider generally is administering the drug in a manner that does not differ from their normal clinical practice, we would not consider them a sub-investigator. And if they're performing research procedures or assessments that represent a direct or significant contribution to clinical data, a procedure that's unique to the study, not one they would form, then we would tend to include them as a sub-investigator. So how do you inform FDA about all these changes that are going on? Now, protocol deviations are generally not reported to FDA in real time. They come in clinical study reports. They are reported to the IRB. On the other hand, global changes to study conduct are generally reported as a protocol amendment. We recognize, however, that during the rapidly evolving circumstances of a pandemic, a sequence of changes may be needed. And it may be that there are a series of deviations, and then you consolidate several protocol modifications into a single protocol amendment, and that would be acceptable if done expeditiously. We do have some specific guidance in the guidance on changes to device trial and in particular their 5-day notification rule. And we have some suggestions about how to flag these amendments for FDA so we know that when they come in, that they're about the COVID-19. Interacting with FDA, there's been some questions about, are these formal meetings? What kind of meetings do we need to do? I would just say we talk about the review division regulatory project managers are the primary point of contact for communication between the sponsor and FDA for drugs and biologics, and for devices, the lead reviewer is that contact. And so FDA and sponsors use various communication methods to focus discussions, to exchange information, and resolve issues efficiently. And FDA staff are really working around the clock to try to be as responsive as possible to sponsors' questions while balancing competing obligations. So again, reaching out to those regulatory project managers and lead reviewers is the first step. We do have a guidance on best practices for communication that may be helpful as well, but as I said, we are trying to be as responsive as possible. Some questions came up. Of course, COVID-19 involves isolating patients when they're hospitalized. Those who aren't hospitalized are isolating at home. But what does that do for informed consent? Certainly one way is to do electronic informed consent. If the patient in an isolation room, for example, has an electronic device that they can do e-consent on, and we have a guidance on the use of electronic informed consent, answers and questions. But we also lay out in the guidance a sort of a procedure that can be done in which the consent form can be provided to the patient, perhaps by a healthcare worker who has entered the room for another reason. We're trying to avoid that consent would lead to more people entering the room than necessary and placing more people at risk. If direct communication is not possible, because often if you have the doors are closed in negative pressure rooms, then an investigator or designee can arrange a 3-way phone call or video call, whatever works with the patient, together with their impartial witness, and if desired or feasible, additional patients. And we lay out a sort of standard process for those calls so you can document that the steps have been gone through, that the patient has had the opportunity to understand what the study is, understand the consent document, have their questions answered, and communicate that they're willing to enroll and that they are signing the informed consent. Now, again, if this is in an isolation room, it may not be possible to get the document out of the room because it may be contaminated. And so we talk about how you can document either if it could be taken a picture of that way or other ways through using attestations of why the signed informed consent from the patient is not obtained. Finally, we have some questions about how to monitor clinical trial sites are closed at times and you can't, or it's difficult to travel to those sites. I would say that all our other guidances remain in effect unless we say otherwise. So there is our guidance for industry on risk-based monitoring, which does talk about the appropriate use of centralized monitoring and reliance on technological advances can meet our statutory and regulatory requirements in appropriate situations. We also have a specific question about if planned on-site monitoring is not possible, recommending a risk-based approach to prioritize which sites and which documents should be monitored, such as critical study site data, and how that might be accomplished, perhaps through a secure remote viewing portal, or even uploading certified copies to a secure repository for review. I think the other thing that is pervasive throughout this guidance is asking you to document, document, and document again. So if you document those contingency measures that you've taken and how they impact the trial, as well as the impacts on individual participant level, that will be very helpful, because we anticipate there are going to be many protocol deviations that may lead to missing data or capture of data outside the protocol windows and other changes. So documenting now so that the clinical study reports in the future can really capture a listing of all participants affected by COVID-19 related to study disruption by their unique identifier by the investigational site and a description of how the individual's participation was altered. So in summary, again, I cannot emphasize enough the safety of trial participants is first. The modification should therefore address safety and at the same time seek to maintain trial integrity, and FDA is being flexible where appropriate. Consider options for remote assessments and alternative delivery of investigational product when that is appropriate. Document those COVID-related protocol deviations and why data is missing if it is. And contact the FDA review divisions for specific questions about clinical trials that may relate to efficacy endpoints, changes in statistical analysis plans, or other key aspects of the trial. As I said, you can continue to submit comments to the guidance through the docket or through our mailbox along with general questions. For review division specific questions, we have some links that will be available with our slides so you can find your contacts. Again, a lot of online resources that I've alluded to, and the links there are all live, so you can find out more information about not only our guidances and the development program, but things like hand sanitizers, compounding, fraudulent activities, importing. Those are the Center for Drugs and the Center for Biologics. And the Center for Devices likewise has a number of links that will provide you information on different topics from convalescent plasma to in vitro diagnostic tests and personal protective equipment. There are also resources for patients, so we do have a specific link for resources for patients along with frequently asked questions that are both in English and in Spanish, as well as some information on donating COVID-19 plasma. You may have heard of that being tested as a potential treatment, and blood donations and the safety of giving blood at this time. So I'd like to acknowledge, before I turn it over to my colleague, to all the healthcare workers who are caring for patients, and to all of the research participants, the sponsors, investigators, and trial staff who are working to find new cures. So I'm going to just leave this slide up for a while. This is our questions about conduct of clinical trials and that email address. But let me turn it over to Dr. Concato, who will be trying to answer as many questions as feasible. We want to thank you for your attention to my talk, and now we'll turn it over for the Q&A to him.
Thank you very much. I'll begin. Well, first, can everyone hear me? Jacqueline, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you very well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right, I'll begin by mentioning that Dr. Corrigan-Karai's presentation certainly will have addressed a number of questions, and reading the FDA guidance on clinical trial conduct, as she discussed, can answer many more. But we'll spend the rest of our time answering questions that have been submitted, and the FDA clinical trial conduct mailbox that was just shown can be used for topics that you have on your mind and we can't get to today. As a final introductory point, you heard in the presentation that the guidance was initially released on March 18th of this year and has been followed by updated versions, most recently on April 16th. The updates you heard include an appendix with additional questions and answers. We're at 17 right now, and more updates will follow. And the point here is that the discussion we're having today is based on the agency's current thinking, but that thinking will expand and evolve as conditions change. Okay, to get started, one question has a very big picture focused, and it was, what is the most important aspect of study conduct to be concerned about during COVID-19? This question gives me a chance to emphasize what Jacqueline had said, which is that ensuring the safety of trial participants is paramount. And at the same time that participant safety is being addressed in a trial, sponsors can look for ways to protect trial integrity, while the agency is being flexible, as she mentioned as well, where appropriate. And I'm hoping that other questions we'll get to will show how this approach can work and can work very well. Okay, there are several questions about the reporting of protocol deviations which occur as a result of COVID-19. And I know, again, Dr. Corrigan-Karai talked about this, but one question was phrased as whether it is nobler to amend the protocol or to document the deviations. That is the question. This gives us a chance to repeat what was said and try to help explain. So to summarize, when protocol deviations occur due to COVID-19, sponsors should document the deviation involved and the specific circumstances. That's where you heard document, document, document. Let's take an example. If the deviation itself might be, say, a missed 3-month assessment at a study site, the reason might be as simple as saying the patient was in self-isolation. Standard reporting processes can be used for the reporting of such deviations, or if the number of deviations involves more than a limited number of participants, then alternative approaches would be reasonable in consultation with the IRB. Let's use the same example. Let's say video conferencing replaces in-person visits due to COVID-19, and that's happening for multiple study participants. Well, then a list of all study visits that are deviations from the protocol for this reason would generally be acceptable. That documentation could include the study reference number, the patient ID numbers, the date of the substituted video visit, the site that would have been visited if not for COVID-19. Here we can refer you to question and answer number 3 in the guidance that provides more details on the topic. And as just one added point of information, and I think Jacqueline might have mentioned this, protocol deviations should be included in final study reports and may also be included in annual reports. Okay, well, a sort of a related question has to do with when do immediate changes to a protocol that is implemented at the sites and then approved by the IRB actually need to be submitted to FDA. Well, to be redundant in a positive sense, we recognize that procedures that are specified in the protocol will need to be modified. There obviously will be a lot of protocol deviations. So when a study-wide change in protocol conduct occurs, we know that changes that are necessary to eliminate apparent imminent hazards, is the exact phrasing in the regulations, to participants can generally be implemented immediately. It's the subsequent submission and formal approval of such changes by the IRB or the IRC that's needed, and then the FDA doesn't approve, but we're notified by filing a protocol amendment to the IND or a parallel filing to a device submission and to the data monitoring committee if there is one. We should also mention, as I think the slides included, that regulations for drugs and biologics differ from device regulations, and the details can also vary based on other factors, but we refer you to our guidance as a good starting point for information, and the mailbox and or the division can be used if we haven't answered your question to its fullest extent. A couple of related comments may also be helpful. First, but just to emphasize, again, the protocol deviations have to be documented, but in terms of the FDA being flexible, we recognize that a sequence of changes may be warranted to address these circumstances during the pandemic. So consolidating several protocol modifications into a single protocol amendment is acceptable, but that should be done expeditiously. It's not a reason to have any delays. And then as a final reminder, if a protocol amendment is not required to prevent imminent harm to participants, then it should only be implemented as usual after it is submitted to FDA, and that would be after IRB approval has occurred. All right, we had questions about reviewing signed informed consent documents remotely while protecting personal information. This topic was covered in the slides. I'll just add that if you want to find it, both question number 10 and question number 11 in the FDA guidance go into great detail. I believe it's almost 2 pages of text in terms of the steps for confirmation, et cetera. that you heard about. But in the interest of time, I'll just leave it as please see the guidance, and I think I'll move on to another question. Okay, if a patient enrolled in a clinical trial is diagnosed with COVID-19 during the study, should this be recorded as an adverse event, or is additional documentation required? First, let's assume that this trial is not testing a drug to prevent COVID-19. But as we know, regulations in 21 CFR 312 would say that any untoward medical occurrence associated with the use of a drug in humans, whether or not it's considered to be related to the drug, should be recorded as an adverse event, and that includes episodes of COVID-19 illness. But the question asks about additional documentation. To address that question, we can mention, for example, that a sponsor also must report to FDA any suspected adverse reaction that is both serious and unexpected, in other words, a SUSAR, but such suspected adverse reactions are reported only if the sponsor determines that the evidence suggests a causal relationship between the drug and the adverse event. So given the current pandemic conditions, including community spread of infection, COVID-19 illness can generally be considered unrelated to a study drug unless specific reasons exist to suggest a causal relationship. So then we go back to the idea that adverse events should be included in annual reports, and in that context, FDA recommends collecting enough details so that the appropriate COVID-19 MEDRA codes can be provided in the study report. Another question asks how to appropriately conduct source data verification for remote site audits with or without electronic medical records being available. This is pretty complicated. We do have a question and answer, but to try to summarize, FDA regulations require sponsors to monitor the conduct and progress of their clinical investigations, but the regulations are not specific about how sponsors should conduct that monitoring. So if planned on-site monitoring visits are no longer possible, sponsors can consider optimizing the use of central or remote monitoring programs to maintain their oversight of the study if technically feasible. Along those lines, risk-based monitoring can focus on trial activities that are essential to the safety of trial participants and to data reliability. So a couple of options. One option might be to establish a secure remote viewing portal that will allow site staff to access, study staff, I should say, to access the site's study documents and participant source documents. The potential for remote access to trial participants' health records, whether they're electronic or paper, can also be explored. A second option would be to upload certified copies of source records to a sponsor-controlled electronic system or to a cloud-based repository with appropriate security controls. Now, in the setting of a blinded or partially blinded study, and if the source documents contain information that's potentially unblind, then, of course, controls to protect the study blind would need to be in place prior to the transfer of the source documents. So a step-by-step assessment and process would need to be used. We will mention it wouldn't be necessary for the clinical site to have control of the certified copies of source documents uploaded to a repository, but the clinical investigator should maintain control of the original source records. And a final comment on this topic would be that the informed consent document should be reviewed to look for any specific restrictions on access to a participant's records. But again, please contact us, use the mailbox if questions arise. There were a number of questions about changes to the statistical plan, but again, time is short, and Jacqueline had addressed this. I think, though, I'll just summarize by saying at the bottom line, the details vary on a trial-by-trial basis. Impactful changes will need to be discussed, with the review division, which, as we know, is not a new requirement. And third, addressing specific questions today, just wouldn't really work. So what we can mention, however, is that sponsors can think ahead about the potential impact of changes in data collection or missing data as well on say, the timing of endpoints is one example, especially when they affect the assessment of effectiveness in particular. So if COVID's impact on achieving study objectives while protecting trial participants is expected to be substantial, I'll echo what Dr. Corrigan-Karai said, that the sponsor should contact the review division to discuss appropriate measures to be taken and potential analyses to be done. We will work with sponsors as they think through these issues, but to emphasize an important point, the time for sponsors to address how protocol deviations will be handled for pre-specified analyses in the statistical analysis plan is prior to and not after locking the database. Okay, a specific question asks whether patients in trials should be screened for COVID infection. This came up, but it seems worth repeating. We mentioned this, by the way, in the discussion section of our guidance, and we mentioned that if COVID-19 screening procedures are mandated by the healthcare system in which a clinical trial is being conducted, then such testing does not need to be reported as an amendment to the protocol, even if the screening is done during a study visit. In contrast, if the sponsor is incorporating data on COVID-19 as part of a new research objective, then an amendment is indicated. In other words, if all patients are being screened at a facility where a site is located and the decision to screen might have been made by facility leadership, then no action is needed. On the other hand, if a trial protocol includes testing for COVID-19 for purposes of inclusion, exclusion, or clinical characterization, then the protocol should say so. Keeping an eye on time, let me just try to get one or two more questions in. One asks about how to conduct a healthy volunteer trial with biologics. They mentioned specifically Q2 in the United States. Well, leaving aside timing and location, just one comment about the benefit-risk balance is perhaps obvious that it's shifted for trials involving healthy volunteers. In other words, the bar is set higher when deciding whether to initiate such studies during a public health emergency, but it still defaults to an assessment of whether limitations imposed by COVID present safety risks to the participants or threats to trial integrity and good clinical practice, and whether there are ways to mitigate those risks. Let me sneak in a last question if I can, looking at the time. It's really a non-COVID question, one might say. Someone is asking whether FDA is accepting IND applications, and if so, will these be delayed? Here we could say that the vast majority of FDA staff are teleworking at this time, and the agency is committed to accepting what might be called routine, that is non-COVID applications. We will do our best to honor commitments that existed before the emergency arose, and that will continue to be in effect now. I see that we're about out of time, so I'll just wrap up by echoing the acknowledgments that Dr. Corrigan-Karai listed at the end of her presentation. I'll also recognize the many agency staff who have contributed to the COVID clinical trial guidance and who are also responding to mailbox inquiries. There are too many names to mention, but the effort represents a collaboration across the Centers for Drugs, Biologics, and Devices, as well as the Oncology Center of Excellence, the Office of the Commissioner, and other offices. These individuals and groups have been working tirelessly to both meet our stakeholders' needs and ensure the safety, efficacy, and security of the products that FDA is responsible for. With that, I'll close my section by saying thank you very much. And someone advanced the slides. I was going to end with the email address for the clinical trial conduct mailbox that both myself and Jacqueline have talked about in our presentation. Thank you again.
Thank you so very much, Drs. Corrigan-Karai and Concato, for this most instructive and timely talk, and for responding to the so many questions that came in that were submitted to us. We are regretful that we could not address them all. As a reminder, the complete recording of this webinar will be on our website within 1 or 2 days. We're going to try to expedite that process. So it will be on our website within 1 or 2 days. In addition, we'll be sending a thank you email to everyone who attended, and it will have the link to the website as well. On behalf of CDER Small Business and Industry Assistance, we thank you for your attention, your attendance, and hope that you enjoyed today's presentation and found it helpful. We look forward to your presence at future webinars, which will be advertised on our website at www.fda.gov/CDER SBIA webinars with an S on the end. And thank you. Stay safe and healthy.